The director was interested in the ability to go to an existing, as he put it, off-the-shelf, self-sustaining, stand-alone entity that could perform certain activities on behalf of the United States.
Are you not shocked that the Director of Central Intelligence is proposing to you the creation of an organization to do these kinds of things outside of his own organization?
Counsel, I can tell you I'm not shocked.
Washington, D.C. is not really run by elected officials. It's run by bureaucrats, the contractors, the surveillance communities, the police agencies. And of course, over the years, that's actually grown now to where you have the Department of Homeland Security, which came into being after 9/11, the massive NSA, CIA operations that are spying on everything Americans do. Nothing is private anymore. That's being realized. What we call the government in Washington, D.C. is really not the government. In other words, when you vote and you elect someone, you're not really electing the government that runs things. There's a deeper government there. It's something which has been called the deep state.
The deep state is the same thing that President Eisenhower reminded people about when he talked about the military-industrial complex.
Now, this conjunction of an immense military establishment and a large arms industry is new in the American experience. The total influence, economic, political, even spiritual, is felt in every city, every state house, every office of the federal government. We recognize the imperative need for this development, yet we must not fail to comprehend its grave implications. Our toil, resources, and livelihood are all involved. So is the very structure of our society. In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. We must never let the weight of this combination endanger our liberties or democratic processes. We should take nothing for granted. Only an alert and knowledgeable citizenry can compel the proper meshing of the huge industrial and military machinery of defense with our peaceful methods and goals, so that security and liberty may prosper together.
So if Eisenhower's warning in the 1950s was something we should take seriously, well then certainly 60 years later, we should be taking it seriously. And so there is this complex, right? There is a professional strata of people in the DC area principally who run the government day in, day out, frankly, decade in, decade out. And they're the professional staffs that man all the departments and agencies in town.
The people that run our government, they're called the Senior Executive Service, the SES grade. Used to be nicknamed super grades. They're above GS-15 level. They're the generals that never go away. They're the civilian clothes-wearing generals of the bureaucracy. They are the deep state, the SESs.
The real deep state is composed of over 8,000 managers in 75 different federal agencies. These are the Senior Executive Service members, and Obama appointed about 7,000 of them. Now, because they're managers, they can tell new appointees what they can and cannot do. This puts the deep state in an unimaginable position of power.
And those folks don't roll over too often. They're usually there locked in for, a 20, 30-year career. They're the folks that are really the deep state. They are the long-term career professionals who do all the heavy lifting at all these different agencies. And so when you have a new president or new administration elected, they can have all the greatest ideas in the world, and they can staff, the senior leadership of their department or agency with their folks. But all the people doing the work, one layer down, they may not necessarily cooperate.
If people have to drive it, the senior leadership, if the SES, if there's ever any group that needs a collaboration video space in the federal government, it's the senior executives across the federal government. What I would like to see is, oh my God, well, what I would like to see is, you know, it's great about going to the American public and we're dealing all this out. Get back in here. These people work for you. You're the president. Call them together. Don't meet with them once in a big room in, you know, Constitution Hall, but start to collaborate with them, because those are the people that hold the keys to the kingdom, the money, and the policies.
They're well organized, and as I just intuitively figured from the deep state, they stretch their roots into nearly all facets of the government. Now, when I was researching SES, I found this interesting guide to the Senior Executive Service from last March. Right in the introduction, they say members of the Senior Executive Service serve in key positions just below the top presidential appointees and are the major link between these appointees and the rest of the federal workforce. These leaders operate and oversee nearly every government activity in approximately 75 federal agencies. So they admit, right in a government document, that SES is the major link between new presidential appointees and the rest of the federal workforce, meaning if an SES member doesn't want something to happen, they can squash out what the current administration is trying to do. Likewise, if they want something to happen that the current administration doesn't want, well, they're the filter for the rest of the federal workforce, so they can just push it through to some degree.
And they don't have to do it obviously. You know, an example would be the acting Attorney General, Sally Yates, who violated her oath and did some horrible things. I can discuss that in detail. But it can be other people who just sort of passively non-comply. You know, they sit in their cubicle and they don't put out the memo they're supposed to, or they don't follow up with the email. And so in each of these ways, there's sort of this incremental chipping away at the legitimacy of President Trump and his administration. Because, you know, the people will say, well, gee, you can't get things done. Of course you can. You know, if half the workforce is actively non-complying against you, those are the sort of frustrations that an administration has to deal with.
A shadowy government with its own Air Force, its own Navy, its own fundraising mechanism, and the ability to pursue its own ideas of the national interest, free from all checks and balances, and free from the law itself.
Colonel North, in your work at the NSC, were you not assigned at one time to work on plans for the continuity of government in the event of a major disaster?
Mr. Chairman.
I believe that question touches upon a highly sensitive and classified area, so may I request that you not touch upon that, sir.
I was particularly concerned, Mr. Chairman, because I read in Miami papers and several others that there had been a plan developed by that same agency, a contingency plan in the event of emergency that would suspend the American Constitution. And I was deeply concerned about it and wondered if that was the area in which he had worked. I believe that it was, but I wanted to get his confirmation.
May I most respectfully request that that matter not be touched upon at this stage. If we wish to get into this, certain arrangements can be made for an executive session.
But they said, don't worry, there's a detailed classified version. But now they've denied the entire Homeland Security Committee of the United States House of Representatives access to their so-called detailed plan to provide for continuity of government. They say, trust us.
Did you know the CIA is implanted in your state government?
No.
Well, I'll explain. First of all, the CIA mission statement says they're not to be operational within the U.S. So they're violating their mission statement. Well, in Minnesota, only the governor and the chief of staff are aware of it. That there's an implanted CIA person in Minnesota government at a level to where he doesn't come and go with elections. It's a permanent position. Why? Why do they violate their own mission statement? And I can only assume Arizona. I don't know if you have one, but I don't believe Minnesota is the exception.
Did you know who it was in Minnesota?
Yes.
And what was the position in Minnesota?
The position was at a deputy level in one of the, you know, I won't go far enough to say, I won't say names because I'm not going to get Valerie
Was it an
Plain.
agency type position?
Well, it's an upper level management position that's permanent. In fact, when this person retired, I was then introduced to the new one. They then recruited a new one and had that person implanted in Minnesota government.
Many of these people who have reached positions of great responsibility, I believe that the most powerful and certainly the most useful agent the CIA has ever had operates in just such a capacity within another branch of the government. And he has been there for so long that few have any idea that he is a long-term career agent of the CIA. Through his most excellent and skillful services, more CIA operations have been enabled to take place than can be laid at the feet of the agency, at the feet of any other, more legitimate agent. This was the plan and the wisdom of the Dulles idea from the beginning. On the basis of security, he would place people in all areas of the government, and then he would move them up and deeper into their cover jobs, until they began to take a very active part in the role of their own organizations. This is how the ST was born, the secret team. Today, the role of the CIA is performed by an ad hoc organization that is much greater in size, strength, and resources than the CIA has ever been visualized to be. So the first question I have here would be, how, quote, on the basis of security, unquote, would Allen Dulles, quote, place people in all other areas of the government?
Well, one of the first things that I realized was that it was Mr. Dulles' desire to have the office that General White asked me to create in the Air Force headquarters in order to create a focal point system. And as Mr. Dulles told me later, he said, I don't want various people from my agency going into the Pentagon and dealing with different people there, and therefore uncovering the activities of the CIA to a large number of people, because obviously such a ring would then proliferate to others, and if they wanted submarines, they'd have to bring in some Navy people, and if they wanted helicopters, they'd have to talk to some Army people. He said, I want a focal point. I want an office that's cleared to do what we have to have done, an office that knows us very, very well, and then an office has access to a system in the Pentagon, but the system will not be aware of what initiated the request. They'll think it came from the Secretary of Defense. They won't realize it came from the Director of Central Intelligence. So you see, the Dulles philosophy was to control the focal point area. This led then to the creation of focal point offices everywhere. And as I established this Tab 6 organization, we called it, in every major staff area within the Air Force, because that was my jurisdiction at the time, I would have cleared people, another focal point, you might say a sub-focal point, a person I could go to who had been given ahead of time the authority to do whatever it was that he was authorized to do. And we stressed that authorized business. He would have to be sure he had orders either from my office or directly up to the Chief of Staff, and that we knew what we were doing for CIA. Well, this leads to another step you might call breeding. We had to work with various agencies of the government, not just the Defense Department. We had to have contact points in the State Department, in the FAA, in the Customs Service, in the Treasury, in the FBI, and all around through the government, up in the White House. And gradually we wove a network of people who understood the symbols and the code names and the things we were doing and how we handled money, which was the most important thing. And then we began to assign people there who those agencies thought were from the Defense Department, but they actually were people that we put there from the CIA. This led to the creation of a system of powerful individuals, people whose jobs were quite dominant in some of these other agencies, especially after they'd been there 2 or 3 years, because we put them in there by talking to the top man, the cabinet officer or the head of the agency, and we'd say, this man is being placed here so that he can facilitate covert activities, and so that he can retain the secrecy that's required, and he will keep you informed at all time. Well, in the bureaucracy, the top people move faster than anybody else, not the bottom people. And so the man we had explained that to maybe a year and a half earlier would be transferred or leave the government, but our man is still there. So one or two cycles of that, and that agency might not even know that guy was there anymore. They would, and I mean, what his origins were, they would think he was just another one of their own employees. And as a result, he became extremely effective, because if we wanted something done, I remember a rather very sensitive operation that I needed some information on, and I needed it from the FBI. I didn't go to the FBI. I went to this guy that we had planted, and he got it twice as fast and in a much better form than I would have gotten from the FBI. Even though I was at that time working from the Office of Secretary of Defense, we had no trouble working with the FBI. It was just to facilitate it. Yeah. These people became very, very adept. By the same token, people that were employees of CIA agents were assigned, even in the Office of the Secretary of Defense. We had certain people there who were CIA employees. Ed Lansdale worked for CIA all his adult career. A person named Frank Hand worked there. Now, the people in the Pentagon thought they were ordinary military employees. They didn't realize, well, just to give you an example, Colonel Lansdale was a full colonel in the Air Force. That was his cover story. And he had been a full colonel for a few years. And the Air Force was promoting some men to general. The question came up, would Lansdale be eligible? And I told Mr. Dulles personally, I said, you know, you can make Lansdale a general if you just write a letter to General LeMay, because you're going to pay the bills anyway, and not the Air Force. A few days later, I got a call from General LeMay's office. He called me in, and he had the list of men that the Air Force was promoting to general. And as I recall, it was only 13 or 14 officers, and LeMay, being General LeMay, knew every one of them intimately except one. I don't know who the hell he is. I'm not going to promote him to a general. And I said, well, don't you have a file on him? He said, yes. He opened it up, and the top letter was from Allen Dulles. I said, he's a very important man for Allen Dulles. It's okay, I'll promote him. Just like that. Well, that's a good way to get a promotion, you see. But that created a very important job within the structure of the Office of Secretary of Defense. Frank Hand had been there for years in the same way. Frank was a civilian of, I always wrote that he was the most important agent that the agency had, because he was operating daily and effectively as a member of the Office of Secretary of Defense. And you can think of the things that a person in that capacity can do when his home base really is CIA. Well, although people didn't believe this when they first heard it, there are assignments like that in the White House. There are assignments like that in the State Department. It's hard to tell the difference, you might say, between Bill Bundy, who was a longtime CIA employee, and McGeorge Bundy, who was in the White House with Kennedy. The two brothers certainly want to act side by side. They have the same goals and the same intentions. Well, there were many things that duplicated like that. So that it wasn't long before, and I'd say by the end of the 50s, early 60s, before we had spread through the government what I called a secret team, a group of people who really knew how to operate the CIA business.